The bright morning sun streamed through the airport windows as an 11-year-old boy clutched his backpack straps, his eyes wide with wonder. This wasn't just any ordinary Thursday. It was going to be his very first time flying on an airplane, and he could barely contain his excitement. His mom, watching him bounce on his toes beside her, couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. "Remember what we practiced?" she asked, adjusting his neatly pressed collar. He nodded eagerly, pulling out his boarding pass just like they'd rehearsed the night before. They'd spent weeks preparing for this special trip to visit his grandmother in Atlanta. He even saved up his allowance to buy a new book about airplanes, which was safely tucked into his backpack along with his favorite blue dinosaur pencil case. The security line moved slowly, but he didn't mind. Every step forward was an adventure, and he took in everything with curious eyes. The big scanning machines, the conveyor belts carrying bags, and the important-looking officers in their uniforms. He'd made sure to wear his best outfit for the occasion. A crisp button-down shirt, chalky pants, and the shiny shoes his mom had helped him polish last night. "Look, Mom," he whispered excitedly, pointing at a pilot walking past them with a smart uniform and rolling suitcase. "That's going to be me someday." His mother squeezed his hand, proud of how her son always dreamed big. He'd been reading everything he could find about aviation since he'd learned about this trip, and he could now name almost every type of commercial aircraft. As they made their way through security, he remembered all the tips his mom had taught him. Taking off his shoes, placing his backpack in the bin, and walking through the scanner with his arms raised just like a touchdown celebration. The TSA officer even gave him a high five for following instructions so well. Their gate was at the far end of the terminal, but he didn't mind the walk. Each step brought new discoveries: shops filled with travel pillows and magazines, restaurants with tempting smells, and best of all, massive windows where he could watch planes take off and land. He pressed his face against the glass, fogging it up with his breath as he watched a massive jet lift into the sky. "That's an Airbus A320, he announced proudly to anyone who would listen, remembering the facts from his book. A couple nearby smiled at his enthusiasm, and an elderly gentleman nodded approvingly at his knowledge. When boarding time finally arrived, he stood tall, holding his boarding pass just like his mother had shown him. His heart was racing with excitement as they walked down the jet bridge. The smell of jet fuel and the sound of the engines made everything feel so real. This wasn't just a dream anymore. Just before stepping onto the plane, he turned to his mom, his eyes sparkling. "This is the best day ever," he whispered, squeezing her hand tight. She kissed the top of his head, knowing that this moment, this pure joy of her son experiencing something new, was precious. Neither of them could have guessed that this exciting morning would soon take an unexpected turn, one that would test their spirits but ultimately show them the power of standing up for what's right. His small hand gripped the strap of his backpack tighter as they approached the airplane door, ready to embark on what should have been just a simple journey to visit Grandma, but would become so much more. The flight attendant stood at the entrance of the plane, greeting passengers with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When the boy and his mother approached, something in her expression shifted. She held out her hand, palm up, waiting for their boarding passes with an impatient tap of her foot. "Tickets, please," she said, her voice notably different from the cheerful tone she'd used with previous passengers. The boy proudly handed over his boarding pass, just like he practiced, but instead of the quick glance she'd given others, she studied his ticket with unusual intensity. "Is there a problem?" his mother asked, noticing how the flight attendant kept looking back and forth between the ticket and her son. Other passengers were starting to queue up behind them, shuffling their feet and checking their watches. "I need to verify this seat assignment," the flight attendant announced loudly, holding up their boarding passes. "These don't look right to me." The boy's excitement began to fade, replaced by confusion. He looked up at his mom, uncertain about what was happening. His mother pulled out their flight confirmation email on her phone. We checked in online yesterday, she explained calmly, though her jaw was tightening. Everything is in order. We've shown our documentation twice already. The flight attendant ignored her, instead calling over another crew member. Can you double-check these? She asked, as if the boy and his mother weren't even there. Something seems off about this seating arrangement. The second crew member quickly glanced at the tickets and nodded. They're fine. Seats 14A and B, everything's correct. But the first flight attendant wasn't satisfied. She turned back to them with narrowed eyes. You're sure this is your correct flight? She asked the boy directly, speaking slowly and loudly as if he might not understand English. The boy, who'd been getting straight A's in his advanced reading class, felt his cheeks grow hot. Yes, ma'am, he answered politely, just as his mother had taught him. We're going to visit my grandmother. His voice was steady, but his hands had started fidgeting with his backpack straps. A nervous habit his mother recognized immediately. Other passengers were starting to notice the holdup. A businessman in a suit frowned, checking his watch again. But then something unexpected happened. The woman behind them spoke up. Excuse me, she said firmly. I've been watching this whole interaction, and I can't help but notice these passengers are being treated differently from everyone else who's boarded. Is there a reason for that? The flight attendant's face flushed. I'm simply following protocol, she said stiffly, but her eyes darted around, noting how many people were now watching. The boy's mother placed a protective hand on his shoulder. We'd like to get to our seats now, she said, her voice calm, but carrying an authority that made the flight attendant step back slightly. Unless there's an actual problem with our tickets. Finally, the flight attendant handed back their boarding passes, though her lips were pressed into a thin line. As they made their way down the aisle, the boy could feel eyes on them. Some passengers looked away uncomfortably, but others smiled encouragingly. You handled that very well, his mother whispered as they found their seats by the window. The boy nodded, but the magical feeling from earlier had dimmed. He pulled out his airplane book, trying to recapture his excitement about flying. Look, his mother said softly, pointing out the window at the ground crew working below. Those are the people who make sure our plane is ready for takeoff. Want to count how many luggage carts they have? He pressed his face against the window, grateful for the distraction. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. The flight attendant's behavior had caught more attention than they realized, and the next few hours would prove that sometimes, standing tall in the face of unfairness can lead to unexpected change. The plane had been in the air for about 30 minutes when the first round of drink service began. The boy was still trying to enjoy his first flight, pressing his nose against the window to watch the clouds drift by like cotton candy. His mother had helped him spot their neighborhood during takeoff, and even though things still felt a bit tense, his natural curiosity was starting to win over. Would you like some water? His mother asked gently. He nodded, watching as other passengers received their drinks from the same flight attendant who had given them trouble earlier. She was all smiles with everyone else, asking about their day and making small talk. When she reached their row, the plane hit a small patch of turbulence. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on, and the aircraft gave a slight shake. It was nothing serious, just the kind of bump that's normal during any flight. The boy had just taken his cup of water when another gentle shake came. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The cup slipped slightly in his grip, and despite his best efforts to steady it, some water splashed onto his tray table. It wasn't much, just a small puddle that could easily be wiped up with a napkin. Look what you've done. The flight attendant's sharp voice cut through the cabin's quiet hum. She was pointing at the small spill as if it were a major disaster. This is exactly what I was worried about, disruptive behavior. The boy froze, his eyes wide. Just 2 rows ahead, another passenger had spilled their entire coffee, and the same flight attendant had simply handed them extra napkins with a kind, "These things happen." His mother spoke up, her voice steady but firm. It's just a small spill. We can clean it up. She reached for the napkins in her bag, but the flight attendant wasn't done. I think we need to move you to the back of the plane, she announced loudly. Were you less disruptive? Several heads turned their way, and the boy felt his chest tighten with embarrassment. That's when something unexpected happened. A gentleman in a business suit across the aisle pulled out his phone and started recording. 2 rows behind them, a woman in a pilot's uniform who was traveling as a passenger stood up. Excuse me, the off-duty pilot said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone listen. I've been observing this situation since boarding, and I have to say, this treatment seems highly inappropriate. Other passengers began murmuring in agreement. An elderly couple a few rows ahead turned around, the woman shaking her head disapprovingly at the flight attendant. We all saw what happened, the elderly man said. It was just a little water, and the plane bumped. You handed me napkins when I spilled my coffee earlier. The boy's mother pulled out her phone and quietly started taking notes. Times, names, badge numbers. She taught her son that in tough situations, facts were your best friends. The flight attendant's face had turned an interesting shade of red. She opened her mouth to say something else, but another crew member, this one with a senior staff badge, appeared beside her. Is there a problem here? The senior crew member asked, looking between the flight attendant and the growing number of concerned passengers. Yes, said the businessman with the phone, and I've got it all on video. The discriminatory treatment of this young man and his mother has been ongoing since they boarded. The boy sat very still, watching everything unfold. His mother had taught him that sometimes the right thing to do was to stay calm and let the truth speak for itself. He noticed how other passengers were now openly showing their support, offering kind smiles, nodding encouragingly, some even writing down their contact information on napkins to serve as witnesses. The senior crew member turned to the boy and his mother with genuine concern. I'm so sorry about this situation. Please let me know if you need anything at all during the rest of the flight. Then she turned to the problematic flight attendant. We'll discuss this later. For now, please work in the back galley. As the flight attendant walked away, the boy felt something shift in the cabin. What had started as an upsetting situation had turned into something else. A moment where people chose to stand up for what was right. The senior crew member returned a few minutes later with fresh drinks and a warm smile. She brought extra snacks too, quietly placing them on their tray tables. But the peace didn't last long. The other flight attendant had apparently decided she wasn't done yet. Everyone needs to return to their assigned seats immediately, she announced, marching back into the main cabin. Her voice was loud enough to wake a sleeping baby who started crying. This entire section needs to be cleared for safety reasons. The boy's mother looked up from her phone, where she'd been documenting everything. She noticed the flight attendant was only addressing the passengers who had stood up to help them earlier. The businessman who'd been recording glanced at his phone again, making sure it was still capturing everything. Ma'am, called out a well-dressed woman who had been quietly reading a legal brief. I'm a retired judge, and I feel compelled to point out that what you're doing could be considered harassment. She stood up, her reading glasses perched on her nose. You're creating a hostile environment based on discriminatory behavior. The other passengers started nodding in agreement. A college student who'd been watching everything unfold raised her hand. I'm studying aviation law, she said, and this is textbook discriminatory treatment in public accommodations. The flight attendant's face turned an even deeper shade of red. I'm following proper procedures, she insisted, but her voice wavered slightly. Which procedures exactly? The retired judge asked calmly. Because I'd very much like to see the airline policy that justifies this treatment. She pulled out her own phone and started taking notes. The boy, who had been quietly watching everything, suddenly spoke up. His voice was clear and steady, just like when he gave presentations in his school's science fair. I just wanted to fly to see my grandma, he said. I read all about airplanes. I know all the safety rules. I was being careful. His simple, honest words seemed to touch everyone who heard them. An older gentleman wiped his eyes. The college student reached over and patted the boy's mother's shoulder. The senior crew member, who had been watching from the galley, stepped forward again. "This has gone far enough," she said firmly. She turned to the problematic flight attendant. "Please return to the back of the plane. We'll handle this properly when we land." As the flight attendant stormed off, something beautiful happened. Passengers began sharing their own stories. The retired judge talked about cases she'd handled involving discrimination. The college student shared why she decided to study aviation law. The businessman put away his phone and pulled out pictures of his own kids. The boy's mother listened to everyone, thanking them quietly for their support. Her son had pulled out his airplane book again, but this time he was showing it to the elderly couple across the aisle, explaining how different planes work. His eyes were bright again, his earlier fear replaced by the joy of sharing his knowledge with interested listeners. "You've raised an amazing young man," the retired judge told his mother softly. "The way he's handled this situation, with such dignity and grace, that's something special." The rest of the cabin had settled into a warm, supportive atmosphere. Other passengers stopped by to offer words of encouragement or share their contact information. The senior crew member made sure they were comfortable and well taken care of. Looking out the window at the clouds below, the boy realized something important. Yes, one person had tried to make him feel small, but so many others had stood tall beside him. His mother had always told him that for every unkind person, there were many more good ones. Today had proved she was right. As they flew on toward their destination, none of them knew that this flight would become much more than just a trip to visit Grandma. It would become a moment that would change things, not just for them, but for many others too. As the plane continued its journey, something remarkable was happening in the cabin. The businessman who had recorded everything carefully showed his footage to the retired judge. She nodded thoughtfully, occasionally making notes on her phone. The off-duty pilot had moved closer, sharing her own experiences of witnessing similar situations throughout her career. 20 years I've been flying," she said quietly, "and it's hard to believe we're still seeing this in 2024. She turned to the boy's mother with a look of determination. "I've already contacted our Pilots Association. They'll want to know about this." The college student studying aviation law had pulled out her textbook, showing the boy's mother specific regulations about passenger rights. "See here." She pointed to a highlighted section. "They're required by law to provide equal service to all passengers. What happened here isn't just wrong, it's illegal." The senior crew member, who had been managing the situation professionally, stopped by their row again. "I want you to know," she said in a low voice, "that I already filed an initial report. Our airline has zero tolerance for this behavior." She glanced meaningfully at the back of the plane where the other flight attendant had been relegated to duties away from passengers. The boy, who had been quietly drawing pictures of airplanes in his notebook, looked up at all the adults gathered around. "Mom," he whispered, tugging at her sleeve, "are all these people really here to help us?" His mother smiled, squeezing his hand. "Yes, honey. Remember what I always tell you about standing up for what's right. Sometimes when you're brave enough to face something unfair, other people find their courage too." The elderly couple from across the aisle joined the conversation. "We've been flying this airline for 40 years, the woman said, her voice firm. "We've already drafted an email to their customer service. This needs to be addressed at the corporate level." The businessman finished reviewing his footage and turned to the boy's mother. "I work in corporate communications," he explained. "With your permission, I'd like to submit this to our legal team. They often handle civil rights cases pro bono." More passengers began sharing their contact information, offering to be witnesses if needed. The retired judge was organizing everything systematically, creating a timeline of events. "Documentation is crucial," she explained. helping the boy's mother collect everyone's information. The off-duty pilot had been making calls during her breaks between helping. "Our union representative will be meeting us at the gate," she informed them. They take these incidents very seriously. What had started as an upsetting situation had transformed into something powerful, a moment where strangers came together to stand against injustice. The boy watched in amazement as more and more people offered their support, sharing stories and working together to make things right. Even some of the passengers who had initially stayed quiet were now speaking up, describing what they had witnessed. A teacher from row 20 came forward to share how she used similar incidents to teach her students about civil rights and standing up for others. The senior crew member returned one last time with an update. "We're about an hour from landing," she said. "I've arranged for a customer service representative to meet you at the gate. They're already aware of the situation and are prepared to address it immediately." Looking around at all the people who had come together to help, the boy felt something he hadn't expected: hope. His first flight hadn't gone as planned, but it had shown him something incredibly important: that good people will always stand up against unfairness, and that positive change is possible when people work together. His mother noticed his thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "I still want to be a pilot," he replied, his voice strong and clear. "But now I want to be like these people too. Someone who helps make things better." The cabin fell quiet for a moment, his words touching everyone who heard them. As they began their descent toward Atlanta, none of them knew that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. As the plane began its final descent into Atlanta, the senior crew member made her way to their row once again. This time, she wasn't alone. She'd brought the head flight attendant who had been working in first class, unaware of the earlier events. "I've been briefed on the situation," the head flight attendant said, her expression serious but kind. "I want you to know that I've personally contacted our ground team. They're waiting to assist you, and our regional manager is on his way to the airport specifically to address this." The problematic flight attendant, still confined to the back galley, could be heard muttering about following procedures, but nobody paid her any attention anymore. The other crew members had made it clear whose side they were on. "Look out the window," the boy's mother whispered to him, trying to lift his spirits as they descended through the clouds. "You can see your grandmother's city down there." His face lit up as he pressed against the window, watching Atlanta grow larger beneath them. The retired judge was still organizing statements from willing passengers. "We have 15 witnesses so far," she told the head flight attendant, "including an off-duty pilot, myself, and several other professionals who are willing to testify if needed." She pulled out her business card, adding it to the growing collection. The college student studying aviation law had filled 3 pages of her notebook with relevant regulations and precedents. "This isn't just about one incident," she explained to those around her. "This is about making sure it never happens to another child." As they touched down, something unexpected happened. The passengers, who would normally be rushing to get their bags and leave, stayed seated. The businessman who had recorded everything spoke up first. "We're not moving until this family is taken care of properly," he announced. Other passengers nodded in agreement. The elderly couple even waved away a flight attendant who suggested they could deplane first due to their age. "Some things are more important than rushing to baggage claim," the elderly woman said firmly, patting the boy's hand as she settled back in her seat. The head flight attendant seemed moved by this show of solidarity. "The ground team is ready," she assured everyone. "And I'll be filing my own report about the exemplary way these passengers came together to support what's right." Through the airplane windows, they could see several people in airline uniforms gathering at the gate. The off-duty pilot, who had made several calls during the flight, nodded in approval. "That's the station manager," she pointed out. "And if I'm not mistaken, that's the regional VP next to him. They're taking this seriously, exactly as they should." The boy, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly sat up straighter. "Mom," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Remember when you told me that sometimes bad things happen so good people can show up?" His mother's eyes welled with tears as she nodded. Several passengers wiped their eyes too, touched by his wisdom. "Well," he continued, looking around at all the faces that had shown him kindness, "I think I understand that now." The plane had come to a complete stop, but nobody moved. The senior crew member made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience as we assist this family first. Thank you all for demonstrating the true meaning of humanity today." As they stood to gather their things, passengers from all over the plane offered words of encouragement. The retired judge handed the boy's mother a thick envelope full of statements and contact information. The businessman sent her the video footage right there. "This isn't over," the off-duty pilot assured them as they prepared to leave. "This is just the beginning of making things right." They walked toward the exit, surrounded by supporters, about to step into what would become a much bigger moment than any of them had expected. As they stepped off the plane, they were met by a group of airline officials in pressed suits and professional uniforms. The regional manager, a tall man with kind eyes, stepped forward first. His name badge gleamed under the terminal lights as he reached out to shake their hands. "I want to personally apologize for your experience today," he said, his voice sincere and filled with concern. "This is not what our airline stands for, and we're taking immediate action." Behind him, two customer service representatives waited with tablets, ready to document everything. The problematic flight attendant finally emerged from the plane, expecting to continue her day as usual. Instead, she was met by her supervisor. "Please surrender your credentials," the supervisor said firmly. "You're suspended pending investigation, effective immediately." The flight attendant's face went pale as she handed over her badge and airport access card. "But I was just following," she started to say, but the supervisor cut her off with a raised hand. "We've reviewed the footage," the supervisor said. "Multiple witness statements have already been submitted. There will be a formal hearing next week." Meanwhile, other passengers were still gathering around the boy and his mother, offering additional support. The businessman who had recorded everything was showing the video to the airline officials, who took notes with serious expressions. "Look who's here," his mother said suddenly, pointing down the terminal. Through the crowd, they could see his grandmother hurrying toward them, her arms already open wide for a hug. The airline had called ahead to explain the situation, and she'd arrived early to meet them at the gate. The boy ran to her, burying himself in her warm embrace. "My brave little man," she whispered, holding him tight. When she looked up at the airline officials, her eyes were fierce with protective love. The regional manager approached her as well. "Ma'am, we want you to know that we're providing your family with lifetime premium status on our airline. It's a small gesture, but we want to show our commitment to making this right." The retired judge, who had stayed to make sure everything was handled properly, nodded in approval. "That's a start," she said, "but I trust you'll be making broader changes to prevent this from happening to anyone else." "Absolutely," the regional manager agreed. "We're already scheduling emergency training sessions for all staff. This incident will become a teaching moment for our entire organization." The off-duty pilot, who had also stayed behind, was deep in conversation with union representatives who had arrived. They were discussing new policies and training programs that could help prevent similar incidents in the future. A young airport employee who had been watching everything unfold approached the boy with something behind her back. "Hey there," she said warmly. "I heard you like airplanes." She pulled out a model plane, still in its box. "This is from our gift shop. I thought you might like it." The boy's eyes lit up as he took the model carefully. It was the same type of plane they had just flown in. His grandmother squeezed his shoulder, smiling through tears. The customer service representatives had set up a small area nearby where they were taking detailed statements. One by one, passengers shared their accounts of what happened, each one determined to make sure their voice was heard. "This isn't just about one flight," the boy's mother explained to the regional manager. This is about making sure every child feels safe and welcome when they travel. The manager nodded seriously. We're planning to review all our training materials and procedures. Would you be willing to consult with us on making improvements? As they gathered their belongings to finally head home with Grandma, the boy looked back at all the people who had stood up for him. The passengers, the airline officials, even the young gift shop employee. His first flight hadn't gone as planned, but it had taught him something powerful about standing up for what's right. His mother had always told him that real change starts with brave people willing to speak up. Today, he'd seen that truth in action, and it was more powerful than he could have imagined. By the next morning, the video of the incident had spread across social media like wildfire. The businessman's recording, shared with the family's permission, had touched hearts worldwide. News stations were reaching out, asking to share their story. The boy sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, enjoying her famous pancakes when his mother's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. A major morning news show wanted to interview them. But instead of focusing on the negative parts, they wanted to highlight how the other passengers had come together to stand up for what was right. Do you want to do it? His mother asked him gently. We don't have to if you don't feel comfortable. She had always taught him that his feelings came first, no matter what. He thought about it while chewing his pancakes carefully. Will it help other kids? He asked finally. His grandmother wiped away a tear at his thoughtful response. The interview aired live from his grandmother's living room. The boy sat tall and spoke clearly, just like he did in school presentations. The best part wasn't getting the bad person in trouble, he told the interviewer. It was seeing how many good people there are in the world. The story resonated with viewers across the country. Soon, other families began sharing similar experiences. The airline's social media channels were flooded with messages, but not just angry ones. People were offering suggestions, sharing ideas for better training, and asking how they could help make things better. The retired judge who had helped them appeared on another news channel, explaining the legal aspects in simple terms everyone could understand. This isn't about punishment, she explained. It's about making positive changes that protect everyone's rights. The college student who had helped them posted about the experience on her university's social media. Soon, aviation law students from across the country were working together, drafting proposals for better airline policies. Back at his grandmother's house, the boy was surprised to receive a special delivery. It was a package from the pilots' union containing a real pilot's cap and a letter inviting him to visit their training facility. We need more young people like you in aviation, the letter read. The airline had taken swift action. The problematic flight attendant was permanently removed from her position. But more importantly, they announced major changes to their training programs. They were bringing in experts to help create new guidelines, and they asked the boy's mother to be part of the advisory committee. Local schools began reaching out, asking if the boy would share his story with other students. At first, he was nervous, but then he remembered how speaking up had made a difference. His first presentation was to a group of third graders, and when he finished, they gave him a standing ovation. You're helping change things, his grandmother told him that evening as they worked together on a puzzle. Sometimes the biggest changes start with one small moment of courage. Social media couldn't get enough of the story, but for all the right reasons. People shared artwork of the boy's dream to become a pilot. Children sent letters about how his story made them feel braver. Even other airlines started reviewing their training procedures. The off-duty pilot who had helped them kept in touch. She sent regular updates about the changes happening in the airline industry. Your story was the push we needed, she wrote. Sometimes it takes one clear example to open everyone's eyes. As the boy and his mother prepared to fly home a week later, they noticed something different at the airport. Staff seemed more attentive, more conscious of how they treated every passenger. The airline had already begun implementing their new training programs. At the gate, they were surprised to see some familiar faces. Several passengers from their original flight had come to wish them well on their return journey. The elderly couple who had supported them brought cookies. The businessman who recorded everything brought a card signed by everyone from that memorable flight. This wasn't just a viral story anymore. It had become a movement for change, all because one boy stayed brave and adults chose to do the right thing. 6 months after that unforgettable flight, the boy stood in front of a packed auditorium at the airline's headquarters. He was there as a special guest at the launch of their new training program, Flying Together, Creating Inclusive Skies. His mother sat in the front row, beaming with pride. The airline had completely transformed its approach to customer service and staff training. The regional manager, who had met them that day at the gate, was now the head of their new passenger rights division. He invited the boy to pull back the curtain, revealing a wall of principles that would guide their staff. Because of your courage, the manager announced to the crowd, we've trained over 20,000 staff members in our new inclusive service program. But more importantly, you've helped us understand that real change comes from listening to our passengers. The retired judge who had helped them that day was there too. She had become a key advisor in developing the airline's new policies. Sometimes the best laws come from real stories, she told the audience. This young man's experience has helped create guidelines that will protect countless travelers. Back at his school, the boy had started something special too. With help from his teachers, he created a stand-up, speak-out club. Every week, students met to talk about how to handle tough situations and support each other. What started in one classroom had spread to schools across the city. The businessman who recorded the video had kept in touch. His company now offered free legal help to families who faced similar situations while traveling. Your story showed us that having proof makes a difference, he told the boy during a video call. Now we're helping others document and address unfair treatment. The off-duty pilot from their flight had big news too. She had been promoted to head of flight crew training, where she made sure every new flight attendant learned about that day. We don't teach this as a story of what went wrong, she explained. We teach it as a lesson in how to make things right. The college student who had helped them achieved her dream too. She graduated and started working for a civil rights organization, specifically focusing on transportation equality. She often cited their case in her work, showing how one moment could spark lasting change. Even the young airport gift shop employee who had given him the model plane was doing her part. She had been promoted to customer service trainer and used his story to teach new employees about the importance of kindness and support. The boy's model plane collection had grown quite impressive. Airlines from around the world had sent him models after hearing his story. But his favorite was still that first one, from that important day. It sat on his desk as he did his homework, reminding him that standing up for what's right could change the world. His mother had been busy too. She traveled to different airlines, helping them improve their training programs. Every time I share our story, she told him, I see people's hearts and minds open up. That's how real change happens. As for the boy's dream of becoming a pilot, it was stronger than ever. The airline had created a special scholarship program in his honor, helping young people from all backgrounds pursue careers in aviation. He was already studying hard, knowing that someday he'd be the kind of pilot who made everyone feel welcome on his plane. One evening, as they looked through photos from that life-changing day, his mother asked him what he had learned from everything that happened. He thought for a moment, then smiled. I learned that one person can start something big, he said. But it takes lots of good people to make big changes happen. And most people are good, they just need a chance to show it. His words, like his story, continued to inspire others. What began as a difficult moment on a flight had grown into a movement, proving that when people stand together against unfairness, beautiful things can happen.